If you struggle with anxiety, then there is one thing that I can guarantee is fueling your anxiety. And if you can learn to control this one thing, I can almost promise that you're gonna see your anxiety go down over time. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Ramsey Dean. I'm a licensed therapist and social worker. And if you wanna learn the number one thing that fuels anxiety and how you can interrupt the vicious cycle it creates, then stay tuned. In order for you to understand what fuels anxiety, first, you need to understand the cycle of anxiety. So, let's say that you have social anxiety. You get invited by a coworker to their house for a dinner party after work. You desperately desire connection with others and you want to go, so you accept the invitation. But soon after, you start to feel anxious. You start to worry about whether or not people will like you, and you become fearful that you'll say or do something stupid and embarrass yourself. You start to feel tense, your heart begins racing, and your negative thoughts get more intense. What you are experiencing is the fight or flight response. In other words, anxiety. And this is the first step in the cycle. Now, at some point, these symptoms of anxiety are going to become too uncomfortable and intense for you to manage. As a result, you start to scramble to find a way to get rid of your anxiety. And what's the easiest way to do that? You decide to skip out on the dinner at your coworker's house and just stay home. This is called avoidance, and it's the second step in the cycle. By skipping out on the dinner, you are going to get fairly immediate relief from your anxiety symptoms. Your worries about interacting with your peers will go away, as will all of the uncomfortable physical symptoms. You get to relax at home and do whatever you want, and that feels good. This short-term anxiety relief is the third step in the cycle. But these good feelings don't last forever because you've done nothing to address the root of your problems. The next morning, you start to worry about going to work because you don't want to face your coworkers that you blew off the night before. You start to feel all of the uncomfortable symptoms of anxiety again, only this time, they are even worse than before. You find yourself stuck in an endless and distressing loop of negative thoughts. Your heart is pounding, and you feel sick to your stomach. These symptoms feel unbearable, and you decide to call out of work in order to cope. This long-term anxiety growth is the fourth and final step in the cycle. What's happening in this situation is that you've taught your brain two things. Number one, social interactions are a real danger that should be taken seriously. And number two, using avoidance as a coping skill keeps you safe. Therefore, the more that you avoid what you're afraid of, the worse your anxiety gets the next time you're faced with a similar situation. In this example, you are literally training your brain to give you more and more anxiety. This cycle is sometimes referred to as the cycle of anxiety or the cycle of avoidance, and it can very quickly spiral out of control. So what's the number one thing that fuels anxiety? Well, if you haven't figured it out yet, it's avoidance. Using avoidance to manage anxiety is like trying to plug a garden hose with a cork. It might work for a little while, but unless you turn off the faucet, eventually the water is going to build up in the hose and the cork is going to blow. In addition to making your anxiety worse, there's another important reason why avoidance does not work. It is because your avoidance will have consequences, and then you'll have even more things to be anxious about. In this example, we see this illuminated. It starts off with you just being anxious about a dinner after work. But now, because of your avoidance, it turns into you being anxious about having to face your coworkers after you blew them off. If you call out of work, now you might be anxious that you're going to get in trouble or lose your job. This might lead to more avoidance, and the cycle continues. It's easy to see how the more you avoid anxiety, the more consequences you have, leading to more things to be anxious about. But I must warn you, avoidance is not always as clear and straightforward as it is in this example. Sometimes avoidance can be more undercover. Let me explain. If you skip the dinner after work, this is known as physical avoidance. Physical avoidance is when you avoid situations, places, or activities that trigger your anxiety. But physical avoidance is not the only kind. What if instead of skipping the dinner, you go, but have a couple drinks of alcohol first in order to help you lighten up and be more social? This would be a form of emotional avoidance. Emotional avoidance is when we suppress or avoid our emotions instead of allowing ourselves to feel them. Another example of emotional avoidance could be going to the dinner but staying silent and not interacting with anybody except for the household cat. Sure, you went to the dinner, but you didn't face your fears of social interaction, and therefore this is still avoidance. Another type of avoidance is called cognitive avoidance. This is where we work to avoid thinking about something. For example, You avoid thinking about the dinner party by scrolling through social media on your phone the whole time. This way, you don't have to deal with your negative and worrisome thoughts. Or maybe you seek excessive reassurance from your peers that everything is okay. You consistently ask them if you've done something wrong or if they're mad at you. This is a form of avoidance. You're looking for external validation in order to quell your anxiety. So what do you do if you are struggling with avoidance? The simple answer is that you have to learn to face your fears even when it feels impossible. A therapist can help you do this in a variety of different ways. One way is through something called exposure therapy. Exposure therapy works by having you make a hierarchy of things you're afraid of, ranging from the least to the most anxiety-inducing. From there, the therapist will guide you in gradually exposing yourself to these situations. An example hierarchy for social anxiety could look like this. Level 1, making eye contact with a stranger. Level 2, initiating a brief conversation with a cashier or someone in the service industry. Level 3, starting a conversation with a colleague at work about a shared interest. Level 4, attending a small social gathering with familiar friends. Level 5, participating in a group discussion at a meeting or social event. Level 6, attending a larger party or event with a mix of familiar and unfamiliar people. Level 7, initiating a conversation with a stranger or someone new at a social gathering. And lastly, level 8, public speaking or making a presentation in front of a group. Do you see how this hierarchy starts off with social situations that are less scary and gradually moves its way up from there? An exposure therapist will guide you through this hierarchy so you can gradually face your fears and stop the cycle of avoidance. An exposure therapist will also work to teach you healthy coping skills so that you're able to tolerate some level of anxiety while you move up the hierarchy without completely falling apart. As you face your fears, you'll learn that your anxiety actually decreases over time rather than intensifying, and this will create a positive feedback loop that will motivate you to keep facing your fears. And over time, the less you engage in avoidance, the more you will recover from anxiety. Another type of therapy that can be very helpful for anxiety disorders is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and you can learn all about it in this video next.